Backup song right there. Thank you for that. One of the things I'm always fascinated about is history and characters from history. And I think I've mentioned before, when I look at my background personally, I come from like a Sicilian and mostly Austrian-German type of hereditary background. But there is a little sliver of my ancestral makeup that apparently has connections to the Czech Republic and the region of Slovakia. And so I've always been interested in that part of the world, and I occasionally subscribe to a whole bunch of emails. I don't know if you're anything like me, but if I don't check an email account for a day, there's like 300 emails in there. But there's a couple of them in that 300 daily emails that I'll actually read, and one of them is kind of a weekly email about a new character from history that I wasn't familiar with. And one came in this week that caught my attention because he was a significant character in the history of Czechoslovakia. The story goes, imagine being told, not by mere suggestion, but as a matter of strict and enforceable law, what you can and cannot say. That was life under communist rule in Czechoslovakia in the early and middle 20th century. Words were dangerous. Truth was carefully curated. If you spoke honestly about what was happening with no filter and no censorship regarding corruption, the oppression, the fear that people genuinely witnessed and experienced, you were not only arrested, many were disappeared. The government didn't just control the newspapers and the media, the government controlled the stories people were allowed to read, the stories people were allowed to hear, the stories people were allowed to believe. It's into that world a young man named Václav Havel was born. Anybody recognize the name Václav Havel? Ah, we got somebody. A history teacher, of course he does. Huh? Yeah, that's right, he's cheating. Václav wasn't a general, he wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a politician, he wasn't an activist. Václav never sought to be a revolutionary figure. Václav was a writer and a playwright, primarily. But most importantly, Václav was a man who believed that truth, objective truth, matters. But in a system built on lies, truth, of course, is a threat. Václav watched his fellow writers pretend to agree with the government because it was just easier and it was safer than resisting. While they wrote stories and productions designed to celebrate their oppressors, Václav struggled to ignore what he and his countrymen were witnessing on a daily basis. He knew that if he stayed silent, life might be comfortable for him and his family. He could write harmless plays, he could keep his head down, enjoy some success, and never really attract any unwanted attention. But he knew to do that meant costing him his soul. His soul yearned for more. His soul yearned for honesty and integrity. And it was his soul that contained the power to change the course of history. Václav had a choice. Stay silent and stay safe, or he could speak truth in the pursuit of change, knowing it would all but certainly lead to very painful consequences. Václav, of course, chose truth. He began writing essays, letters, and stage productions exposing the lies of the communist regime, calling the nation back to freedom and justice and integrity. He never shouted. He didn't lead mass protests. He never employed violence. Václav simply wrote and told the truth with every letter. It didn't take long before the government took notice. They surveilled him, they threatened him, they harassed him, and eventually they arrested him and imprisoned him. Multiple times, in fact, Václav was in prison. They even resorted to breaking him with isolation, humiliation, and torture. All in, Václav reportedly spent more than 8 years in prison and was repeatedly during that time given a choice. And any time you could walk free. All you have to do is simply stop. Sign an agreement that's saying you're going to stop writing, stop speaking, go silent, and you could live out your days. he chose otherwise. One of his most famous lines became a rallying cry for freedom in Czechoslovakia. It was a letter he wrote from prison, and the line is, "The power of the powerless is truth." Years later, when the communist regime finally collapsed, crowds flooded the streets chanting his name, Václav Havel, the playwright, the author, the prisoner. He would go on to be elected the first president of the free Czechoslovakia. He didn't win by force. He won by faithfulness. He didn't begin with power. He began with courage. He teaches us something vital. Sometimes doing the right thing will cost you everything. But choosing to do nothing in the vain pursuit of safety will cost you your soul. Now, many of us have the opportunity or the need, praise God, to stand in defiance against an all-powerful, oppressive government. I'm sure many here this morning can relate in some, at least small way, with Václav's story. There are moments in life when doing the right thing, the noble thing, doing the thing you know God has been calling you to do, you know by doing it won't make your life any easier. In fact, by chasing God's will and being faithful to God's call, chances are your life will be made a lot more difficult. There are circumstances in which being obedient to God's call in our lives will not only fail to lead us to greener pastures, but rather straight into the heart of a storm. That's precisely where Paul finds himself in our readings this morning. As you may have already noticed, we're covering not one, but 2 chapters of the book of Acts today. Now my goal, just so you're aware, for some general housekeeping here, my goal is to complete this series, this year-long series it's been, spanning both the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. We started this back in January. My goal is to finish it before December. I have a special Advent-themed teaching series in mind. So my goal is to read this and discuss the final 7 chapters of Acts by the final Sunday in November. So we've got a lot of ground to cover, but we're going to do it. At this point in the story, as we turn to the pages of Acts 22 and 23, we find Paul in the city of Jerusalem. You'll remember, if you've been following along in the story thus far, that Paul is in Jerusalem for one specific reason. He came to deliver a gift, a financial gift. A gift that was reportedly a substantial sum. It was a gift from the Gentile churches scattered throughout the Roman Empire to the primarily Jewish church in Jerusalem. And this gift wasn't motivated by some natural disaster or some specific economic need. This was a gift of unity. An expressed desire from the more financially stable and thriving Gentile Christians to share their material blessings following the acceptance of the spiritual blessings provided and promised to the Jewish people. And Paul explains this in Romans 15. We read this last week. He says, I'm on my way to Jerusalem in the service of the Lord's people there. For Macedonia and Achaia were pleased to make a contribution for the poor among the Lord's people in Jerusalem. They were pleased to do it. And indeed, they owe it to them. For if the Gentiles have shared in the Jews' spiritual blessings, they owe it to the Jews to share with them their material blessings. Yet as the saying popularly goes, no good deed goes unpunished, right? From the moment Paul arrived in Jerusalem, we read about this last week, the moment he returned to what he would likely describe as his, quote, hometown, he has faced nothing but persecution and suffering. Paul's goals in Jerusalem were simple. They were pure. They were true. He wanted to bring an offering to those who could use it. He wanted to help unify the church, the Jewish church, with the Gentile church. He wanted to share Christ with his people. Those were his goals. Yet instead of a grand welcome with open arms and a warm embrace, Paul was greeted by mob violence. He was beaten. He was arrested. He was misunderstood. And worst of all, he was rejected by the very people he came to help. Yet in the darkest moment of these 2 chapters, Paul was encouraged and blessed by the final verse that we read this morning, that Sylvia read for us. Acts 23, verse 11, the final line says that Jesus himself presented himself to Paul in the midst of all of his suffering and told him to take courage. Just as you've testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. That's not ominous at all. Now, before we get to Paul in Rome, and before we unpack how the journey for him begins towards Rome, I want to reflect on a few of the lessons I see stemming from that correlate with both Vatsel's story that we just talked about, as well as Paul as he reflects them here in Acts 22 and 23. Each of these lessons, I believe, are reminders to us of how we should handle ourselves, how we should react when the winds of this chaotic world blow against us, as we take those necessary steps of walking by faith courageously and boldly towards God's call on our lives. If we're willing to walk into the storm, so to speak, if we're willing to trust God and pursue the things that He is calling us to do, you can better believe that the powers that be are going to come out against us. How do we react to that? How do we respond? I see three very clear lessons coming from the chapters we just read this morning, and I want to start with the first one that just leaps off the page from Acts 22. In light of the gospel, connection comes before correction. In light of the gospel, connection comes before correction. The story of Paul in Jerusalem started last chapter. It was something we talked about already. We read much of it last week. In Acts 21, we read that the whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. They seized Paul, they dragged him to the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Paul's just been beaten by an angry mob. They weren't holding back. In fact, we find out they want to kill him. They aren't just interested in having him suffer. They want him dead. And the only thing standing between him and certain death was a Roman military commander and his troops. Yet, even they didn't treat him like an innocent man. They arrested him and immediately put him in chains. But unlike most of us, perhaps I should speak for myself, unlike me, how I would almost certainly react, Paul doesn't lash out. Paul didn't immediately profess his rights and demand justice as a Roman citizen. That will come, surely. That's not off the table by any stretch. However, it's not where Paul begins. You see, twice Paul does something that catches people off guard. In verse 37 of chapter 21, again, we're going back to last chapter, Luke says, as the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" To which the commander responded, "Do you speak Greek?" Now, if I'm going to be completely honest with you, I don't like the way the New International Version translates this exchange because it doesn't make it easy to understand like the context and the vibe behind what is being said here. To the commander of the Roman troops, Paul isn't merely being polite and saying, "Hey, can I say something?" That's not what he's doing here. And the commander certainly isn't responding by saying, "Sure, you can say whichever you want as long as you speak in Greek." That's not how the exchange is happening. You see, Paul asked the Paul asked the commander the question in a very particular way that is revealed in the original language with a particular goal in mind. Paul is attempting to connect with the Roman commander by speaking in Greek, the language of the Romans. The commander's responding question wasn't a question of judgment or expectation. It was one of genuine bewilderment. Wait, you speak Greek? Like, you understand me right now? That's what he's saying. The commander didn't expect Paul to speak Greek. The commander believed he was some terrorist leader from Egypt. That's what we find out in the rest of the story. By speaking Greek to the commander, Paul instantly connected with his oppressor. And he builds an instant rapport with him. And it's this connection and rapport that ensured he received a positive response when Paul asked for what he truly wanted, an opportunity to address the mob. But again, take note of the choice Paul makes and the reaction that choice causes among his accusers, even amongst the mob. The story goes on, after receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic, "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became silent. Within 5 verses, we find Paul speaking not one, or speaking to not one, but two different audiences, in not one, but two different languages. And this wasn't just simply a strategy he was trying to use to employ some defense. This was his opportunity to establish a connection with each of these people. To the Roman soldiers, he spoke Greek. To the Jewish mob, he spoke in Aramaic, which was the local Hebrew vernacular at the time. And it instantly establishes a connection. Paul has a message for both groups, but instead of instantly launching into the message, he carefully and intentionally chooses to connect with his audience first. And just in case you think I'm making a mountain out of a molehill here, just consider how most conflicts tend to play out personally. In most conflicts, people, they don't try to connect with one another. In most conflicts in your life, in most conflicts, people just shout and yell over one another. There's no intention of connecting with your audience or the person with whom you're engaging. It's about dominance. It's about superiority. It's about winning. If this was the scene of a Jewish mob clashing with Roman troops, the Roman commanders wouldn't have lectured the Jewish people in Aramaic. They would have lectured them in Greek, whether they could understand them or not, because they want to demonstrate their cultural and military dominance over them. Of course, the same is true vice versa when the Jews towards the Romans. They weren't going to suddenly change their language in order to communicate with their Roman oppressors. They would have screamed and shouted in their native tongue in defiance of their oppressors. But Paul chooses connection over correction first. Paul speaks of this humble respect for others, choosing to connect with people by whatever means possible in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where he famously says, "Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I become like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I become like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those who are under the law. To those not having the law, I become like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel." This humble posture in the midst of conflict is reflective of the gospel itself. God could have simply sat on his eternal throne and with judgment in his heart condemned us for our sins and our rebellion against his law. Instead, what did he do? Instead, God chose to humble himself by entering his own creation, not even as a king on a white horse, but as a child born in a manger, to grow among us, to live among us, and to suffer and experience death with us. God chose to connect with us before he corrected us. And I think this is something we desperately need to get back to as Christians. I'm not suggesting that we compromise our values or willingly entertain sin, but instead of approaching people who believe and live differently than us from a position of self-righteous judgment and moral superiority, our hearts should reflect the grace and mercy which we have received and experienced from our holy and righteous God. We must approach the world around us with grace and mercy, eager to connect in hopes of delivering people from the darkness which is luring so many to eternal condemnation. So our first lesson from Acts 22 and 23 is simply, in light of the gospel, connection comes before correction. And if you want to rephrase that, maybe write it this way: people tend to listen best when they feel heard and loved first. Let's consider our second lesson from the text. The second lesson I draw from Acts 22 is similar to the first. It just takes the stakes up a notch, and it's simply this: as a follower of Jesus, obedience comes before understanding. As a follower of Jesus, obedience comes before understanding, and I'll explain what I mean by that here. For 2/3 of Acts chapter 22, Paul is recounting his testimony before a Jewish mob, the vast majority of that chapter. And this story should sound familiar to you because it's basically a retelling of Acts chapter 9. In Acts 9, we're given the story of Paul's encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. We've read this story. But we get it from Luke's perspective. We get it from like a third person's viewpoint. It's Luke's telling the story of what happened to Paul from an outsider's set of eyes. Here in Acts 22, Paul is telling the story himself, from his perspective. And what's interesting about it is how much it's the same, of course, but I always love the little nuances and differences that we find between the two texts. You know, most of it reflects perfectly back to the original story, but there are some interesting differences which are worth exploring. They're not contradictions, mind you, just they're a fascinating reflection on the power of personal perspective. What you witness versus what I witness may be the same exact event, but we see it with a different lens. And that's what we see happening here. What Luke emphasized in Acts chapter 9 is slightly different from Paul's take on the same story. And one of the key differences between the two stories is found succinctly communicated in verse 10. You see, in Acts 22, verse 10, Paul is speaking. This is after Jesus appears before him. He has gone blind. He's overwhelmed by the brilliance of what he's experiencing. Jesus identifies himself to him. And we're told that Paul said to Jesus, "What shall I do, Lord?" You see, in Acts 9, we have no reference of Paul asking Jesus that question. We find Paul asking Jesus who he was, and then immediately thereafter, after identifying himself, we're told Jesus just tells Paul what to do. He says, "Now go to a man named Ananias," or "Go, you'll meet a man named Ananias." In the Acts 22 version, Paul says he asked Jesus, "What shall I do?" In other words, he had an opportunity to ask Jesus a question. And I don't know about you, but if I'm standing before the resurrected Lord and I've got God himself standing before me, I might have a bazillion questions on my mind, and the first one is not going to be, "What do you want me to do?" I'm just being completely honest with you. I'm going to be asking God about, give me an explanation for everything that has played out in the course of history, or at least in the course of my life. He could have asked Jesus like I would, give me a detailed forecast of how my future is going to play out. What investment should I make, God? Like, who should I bet on? He could have requested some kind of assurance of his own personal safety. He could have asked God for some sort of a financial reward for his service in Jesus' name. This is a big change for me, Jesus. If I shift gears like this, how am I going to benefit from this? These might be some of the questions, if I'm being completely honest with you, that I might have asked Jesus when he's standing before me. But Paul doesn't. Paul asks Jesus one question. "What shall I do? What do I do next, Lord? Where should I go? How can I be of service?" Paul's response immediately reminds me of the response of Abraham when Abraham was introduced to God. The writer of Hebrews reminds us in chapter 11, verse 8, he says, "By faith Abraham obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going." Wow. I mean, if you're anything like me, I have a tendency to experience what I often call paralysis by analysis. I want the details. I want to understand the whole story from every possible angle before I make a decision. There are times when I can even be so bold as to demand that whole story from God. I may sense that he's calling me to do something, but you better believe I'm going to be Googling it before I go. Those urges to make a decision or to pursue a goal merely open a can of worms in my mind. How might this work out? What are the costs involved? What are the odds that this is going to actually work? Is there a risk of failure? Will it make me look foolish? The questions like that. I just want to know why I'm sensing a particular calling. I want to get my head around every possible outcome and whether or not the cost-benefit scales are balanced. But God doesn't work that way, does he? He has never worked that way. And he shows no signs of ever working that way. Since the dawn of creation, God has instructed his people to just trust him, to walk in faith with him, believing that whatever comes our way, whatever happens, we are in his hands. Abraham walked by faith. Moses walked by faith. David walked by faith. The prophets walked by faith. And even Jesus' own personal disciples who were with him in the flesh for 3 years were simply instructed to drop your nets and follow him without further explanation. As the saying goes, hindsight is always 20/20. The whys and the hows, we'll get them maybe some point later. Perhaps we won't get that until eternity. Whatever the case may be, obedience comes before understanding. So while the chaos and the storms of life in this world spiral around us, remember these two lessons. Connection comes before correction. Obedience comes before understanding. And quickly, I want to finish this chapter with one final lesson. Paul delivers his testimony to the Jewish mob. He connected with them. He openly professes obedience to God to them. Yet the bloodlust of the mob wasn't satiated. Is that the word I'm trying to say? I typed it, but I can't even speak it. Satiated. They cried out for Paul to be martyred. The Roman soldiers, the commander, were confused as ever. They had no basis for understanding why this mob was so angry with Paul. So they make the decision, you know what we're going to do? We're going to beat it out of Paul ourselves. That was their plan. The mob wasn't making any sense, so maybe if they stripped and flogged Paul, he would confess to whatever he did to upset them. It was a cruel and sadistic time. Thankfully, we don't live in that time, right? Humans can be utterly brutal. However, just before they bludgeoned him, Paul interjected with another unexpected question. As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't been found guilty?" A Roman citizen. Well, this changes things. You see, a Roman citizen had rights. A Roman citizen couldn't be arrested and beaten without a trial. And after a few meetings and some heated conversations, the plans suddenly shift. The Romans decided rather than illegally beating Paul and getting answers that way, they would, take him back to the Sanhedrin, which was the gathering of the top-level Jews of the day. And maybe they could give some insight into what was going on here. However, once Paul stood before the Sanhedrin, he makes another unexpected comment. Standing before the Sanhedrin, knowing that they're Pharisees and Sadducees, he says, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descending from Pharisees, and I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection." When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe in all these things. To make a long story short, first Paul leveraged his Roman citizenship to stop them from torturing him. Then, while standing before the Sanhedrin, Paul intentionally makes a statement that he knew would cause the Sanhedrin to turn in on itself and argue amongst itself. It'd be like us standing before Congress and saying something about the shutdown or the budget. They want to hear me about some random topic. Okay, talk about the shutdown. It would just immediately get them to, crossfire, right? Instant fireworks. The argument in the room became so fierce, the Romans were forced to protect Paul once again. They removed him from the scene. They retreat him back to the safety of the barracks. And at this point, that Paul is greeted with another personal interaction with Jesus that we've already read from verse 11, where Jesus tells him, "Take courage. What you just said to the Jews here in Jerusalem about me, you're now going to go to Rome." Here's the final lesson. In the kingdom of God, every gift is an asset for evangelism. Whatever talent you have, whatever interest you have, whatever background or education you have, whatever experiences that you have had, all of it is a tool that God wants to use for his glory and his purposes. Just as Václav Havel used his gift of writing and his heart for truth to help topple the Soviet communist regime in Central Europe, Paul leveraged his Roman citizenship as well as his knowledge of the theological and political divide between the Pharisees and the Sadducees to ensure his journey toward Rome began. That's where we're heading now. Paul's going to head now towards Rome. And he used his gifts to make sure that happened. I hope you know that every gift you've been given in life, every skill, every talent, every interest, every credential, every personal passion project, everything you have, no matter how minute it may seem to you, it's an asset that God wants to use and will use if you permit him to glorify his name and expand his kingdom. Connection comes before correction. Obedience comes before understanding. And every gift is an asset for evangelism. Walk by faith